Hello, and welcome to another day of the Internet Measurement Village. Joining us today is Khairil, the Executive Director of the Sinar project, who's going to be telling us all about measuring Internet censorship in Southeast Asia. Thanks for joining us, Khairil.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
There we go. So off to you.
All right. So, okay. Thanks to Arturo and Maria and the OONI team for having me on. So I'm just gonna go today on the experience that we have and a little brief history of Sinar project and our partners in doing network measurements in Southeast Asia. So let's just get right into it. So a little bit of history on, because it's now been, I think, almost 5 or 6 years now that we've been doing monitoring of internet censorship. So our original, foray into network measurements in Malaysia was in 2013. Which was the last election, the election before the last one for Malaysia. And back in 2013, the internet environment was quite different than what it was now. HTTP was prevalent. Unencrypted connections were common. And that was the first time that we started seeing certain URLs being blocked. In the case of Malaysia, it was some politically connected or political issues or YouTube videos that were blocked. And several, independent efforts were doing testing in Malaysia, and we all through different methods found that there was some sort of DPI or deep packet inspection happening that were matching the URLs in the browser requests that were causing, interestingly enough, the URLs of a few pages to feel like they were being slow or delayed. So after about 20 or 30 seconds, if the string matched certain sites that were being blocked, it felt like the site was slow or your internet connection was slow. But if we actually split the string of the headers so that the words or the URLs were broken apart, you would have instant access to the website. So that was our first site situation where where you needed to do some sort of more technical tests to prove whether something was just slow, or to be a little bit clearer whether it was just your slow connection or a slow site. And then it happened again in 2014 in Malaysia. And interestingly enough, it was again a similar approach where there was some sort of deep packet inspection of just specific URLs and on just 1 or 2 ISPs. So that's when we, and then when these sort of tests were done, we started getting similar kind of denials. It's like, no, it was not blocked, or it didn't happen, or it didn't happen on some people. And so without systematic censorship testing and multiple tests, it was difficult to actually, prove your case that it was actually blocked. It could be just one set of measurements that you have. And then, of course, you could also be questioned on how rigorous your measurements are, or how good they were. And in Malaysia, we thought, like, okay, we're going to probably need to do, network measurement tests, and we're going to need more clients and more networks, and we're going to need a variety of different tests whether it's DNS hijacking, or is it a black hole routing, or is it some other sort of interference? And we started to do our own homegrown site, and of course we ran challenges into this, being such a small team at that time. And around that same time as well, we found out that there was the OONI project, and it did everything that we wanted to do, and all the kind of network measurements and the idea of building clients and publishing the data publicly, and so we're like, okay, this is exactly what we need, and we kind of joined the amazing community that OONI has in building and testing. So just a quick regional overview. Some of the data in here is slightly outdated, but there certain things haven't really much changed in terms of the censorship measurements and the legal environment. So one of the things about Southeast Asia is that it's a fast, the rate of adoption, or in terms of internet access, and the penetration of internet access is growing at extremely fast levels. So even though, say, for example, here in Malaysia, I think we're much higher than that now from 2016, probably around 80% right now, is that we're in a very highly connected environment in terms of access to internet. And if it's not, it's rapidly increasing, such that such that it's fast. So I'm just going to go through a few countries. Most of the countries, so we're starting here with Malaysia, have some sort of digital act related to online that can result in sites being blocked or censored. So in Malaysia, we have the Communications and Multimedia Act. That is the law that's often used, or I think it's one of the laws that is needed to use to order ISPs to block or to block a specific website. And it's a quite broad law that bans anything that's indecent, threatening, offensive, or even insulting. And it's not clear in terms of exactly what those things actually cover. As such, it's been used politically, and I'll come back on that usage in Malaysia. So in terms of the overview from about Malaysia has had some changes in government. We've had a relatively authoritarian government from 2015 to 2018, which included scandals like the 1MDB issue, which is a huge multi-billion-dollar scandal involving offshore companies, money laundering in Swiss banks and whatnot, of Malaysian state funds. And during that time when that scandal happened, we had a lot of websites being blocked, news outlets, blogs, even medium.com was blocked for some time because it was carrying some articles related to the scandal. This resulted in 2018, where the last elections, that government was voted out. And we had a new government in, and within a few days, our testing then showed that most of these politically related websites were removed. Were no longer blocked. But we still had a few sites still left over that were still being blocked in Malaysia. This includes things like a few LGBT sites, some fan fiction sites, and a few interfaith religious sites, as well as some far right far right Islamic sites. But these were kind of like leftover ones from before. It's not, the coverage of these blocks for these issues is not extensive. But it just still shows that even when you do have a change in government, that you still need to continue testing. Thailand, I think, again, this is probably going to be much higher now in terms of internet penetration. There's 7 major ISPs providing and 6 providing mobile internet. This is probably not accurate anymore, might be more or less. But there are strong relationships between the government and ISP, which means that the ISPs will cooperate with censorship. This is the work of our friends, Thai Netizen, which provided inputs on this. And in Thailand, they have several laws. They have a similar law like Malaysia, a Computer-Related Crime Act. And they also have less majesty laws. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correctly. So basically, if you insult the king or royalty, there can be quite severe repercussions on that. Testing at that time, which is about 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Thailand is a little bit interesting in the sense that the results showed, multiple websites being blocked through DNS hijacking or HTTP proxies. So we found sites such as WikiLeaks, .org being blocked, or some censorship circumvention tools. And even some news outlets like New York Post, I think they were carrying some articles related to the royalty. But what was interesting in Thailand was that it was not consistent, as in not all ISPs blocked everything. So, like for example, WikiLeaks.org might only be blocked on 1 or 2 ISPs, which I'll cover later, and why we need to have extensive coverage because ISPs are diverse sometimes. And as to what their motivations are for blocking, if it's not specifically government mandated. Again, Myanmar is another country that has changed by leaps and bounds. So again, this 19% is probably wrong and much higher now. And there's now a few ISPs I think are coming in as well. So at this time, when we did the testing in 2016, and you'll have the State of Internet Censorship report in Myanmar, the ISPs are state controlled. And in their case, for Myanmar, they have a telecommunications law that allows the government to censor information and set up surveillance. And they also have another law, which is the Computer Science Development Law, which requires a permit to import computing equipment, and also various defamation laws that can be used for online censorship. Interestingly enough, when we actually do the testing, is that we didn't actually find much evidence of any blocking. Although there were some signs of TCP/IP and HTTP blocking of the U.S. Embassy website and another organization, but generally we didn't actually find any data on blocking of sites. Of course, there's other issues in Myanmar where there's entire shutdowns of regions, but in terms of like individual URL censorship at that time, there was not much. But I'm going to cover some other tools on where we can actually see an overview of what's happening right now in a bit. So it's the same thing in Indonesia. Again, large amounts of internet usage. And again, whatever numbers I'm sharing here is probably maybe 10 to 20% more than what it is now in the past 5 years. In their case, for Indonesia, in terms of censorship for the internet, they have an electronic information and transactions law that that has these following points where they can block things such as defamatory material, threats and extortion, or gambling. Again, the results that we had then is, there's at least 161 websites of a variety of mundane to, gambling and pornographic websites. And a common theme across, and it's still happening now, is the use of what we call, primary like DNS hijacking, which is basically if you use the DNS provider automatically given to you by your ISP, the site that you're supposed to go, you reroute it to somewhere else, either a blog page or just to I don't know, like a routing black hole that goes nowhere. Indonesia is also quite interesting in the sense that they at times have blocked Vimeo and Reddit banned. So those sites showed up during those testing. But interestingly, what we found that the censorship was actually implemented on sites of reinforcements of cultural norms, not so much on political issues. And just like Thailand, it varied from ISP to ISP in terms of these block sites related to cultural norms. So some ISPs had blocked a lot of them, and some ISPs didn't block any of them. So again, coverage is needed. Okay, so that's a kind of outdated overview for about a few years, because except for the Malaysian case. So questions like, why test? And usually the biggest problem is the fact that we need data-backed evidence. So what tends to happen is that, say, for example, the freedom of, you see these kind of rankings on the freedom of internet, or, of countries, or the freedom of online press. And if you actually see some of the measurements in terms of why a country is lower or higher in terms of online censorship or these kind of freedom rankings, is that they tend to use just anecdotal news reports. It's like 5 sites were reported blocked in the news. There was a report by somebody quoted in something in an article that said such and such sites were blocked. And this is it may be possible that some of those experts cited in some of these reports actually did proper tests, but again, it doesn't give a very good coverage of how free an environment for a specific country is in terms of censorship. So we need data-backed evidence for these sort of reports. And the other common situation is that if you don't have data-backed evidence, it's relatively easy to challenge your assertions on censorship. It's like, oh, I tried it and I could not access it. That's not scientific enough, and it can be challenged or denied. So the next step is how do we do testing to get this sort of information, and what kind of environments and lessons have we learned doing these sort of tests in Southeast Asia? Well, we found that there's 2 types of scenarios when doing this. One is what we call continuous testing. So these are tests that you want to cover over time consistently. So you want to have you want to test every single online media site, for example, every single day, and maybe if you have enough bandwidth and data to test it every single hour as well. So the reason for doing this is that you get enough data in terms of sites blocked over time. But you also have enough data to do things like heuristics. If you have a large amount of continuous set of data tests, it's a lot easier to see which ones were bad and which tests were incomplete and so on. So you're actually able to have a lush data set to do certain things, like, for example, different periods of censorship. So if a website is, let's say for a newspaper, is blocked today, was it blocked the month before? So if you didn't test, the month before or the year before, it could be possible that it was blocked, but you don't have evidence for it. So so in order to compare like whether some country or some area is more free than, let's say, a month ago, or more free after, let's say, a regime change, you're going to need to have this consistent set of data, across like long time periods, and not just by time coverage, but also in terms of coverage of how many tests are you testing. So, for example, you can't just test, 2 or 3 news media outlets. You have to test every online news media outlet, whether it's state backed media, or it's independent media, or if it's independent media by different, kind of ownership by different media companies and so on. You're going to need to ensure enough coverage of this so that you can actually show, for example, that state-backed government media sites were not blocked and independent sites were blocked. So you're going to need to do the testing for both of this. I think our friend Igor at Metallica is doing an amazing job on these tests in terms of the citizen-led test lists. So do check out his video. So these test lists are the ones where we actually have the number of URLs to ensure coverage of tests. And it covers different categories for rights and freedoms, like press and religion and critical criticism. So as you can see here, and I just took this off today from OONI Explorer, is you can see that here in terms of measurements for just a few countries in Southeast Asia, that in Malaysia, we have the most coverage for measurements, and we really need to do a lot more for the other countries in terms of getting more comprehensive measurements. So some countries do have a higher risk. When we did a quick review of the different laws in Southeast Asia, none of the countries actually had any specific laws that says you can't access a website. But the problem is that for countries that are a little bit more authoritarian, let's say Vietnam, even though it's technically not illegal to do it, or testing sites such as so some of the test lists in OONI cover things like terrorism websites and so on, that might cause you to be under under surveillance, or possibly red flagged, even though you're just doing testing. So in countries where it's a little bit more risky to do these sort of things, it's a little bit harder to do test lists. But in other countries, let's say Thailand or Malaysia or Singapore and Indonesia, there really is no reason why more tests shouldn't be done. So we should increase our advocacy of these in terms of trying to get more data, continuous data to be done. Of course, the easiest way to do this is on servers that run 24/7, and we used to do this before with the Python version of OONI Probe, and the easiest way to do this was the Debian package, or those packaged with the operating systems, and we would just run that as constantly, even on Raspberry Pis, for example, so that it just continuously collect and test for data. Now, I guess OONI Probe has the new Golang version, probe.cli-cli, which is also a lot easier for people that are managing Unix or Linux systems, because we can do things like cron jobs and so on with probe.cli and pass parameters on how much testing that we need every hour or every day, and so on. So yeah, in Malaysia right now, we're running about 100 tests on one ISP at least, every day, every hour, 24/7, to be able to constantly check. So I did mention earlier that what kind of sites do we actually test and how we need to do better coverage. We need the test lists. I'm not going to go through the test list, but will show why they're actually really important for our measurement. Because the test lists cover a whole lot of different URLs, and it's categorized by what we call kind of rights-based categories, such as religion or news media, or sex education, gambling, pornography, and whatnot. These test lists, not only do they provide the lists of the URLs that we constantly test, but the categories also allow us to extract data that we collect from the measurements to be able to generate reports. So they're the test lists are kind of the glue that we need to do some, not only in terms of the coverage of the tests, but also the analysis of the tests. So if we have good coverage of the test lists, and again, I'll refer to our friend Igor at Natalica, do check his video out. That if we have good coverage of this, it means that we have good coverage on the probes. It means that we have good coverage of test sites on our continuous, OONI probe command line tests on our servers. And that will make sure that we have enough measurement data and collected by OONI. So that's on the on coverage of tests. But on the other side, though, is the fact that if these test lists and URLs are being tested, if we're using the same categories as the Citizen Lab test lists, we can also extract reports based on categories. So it means that out of the millions of measurements that are available publicly at OONI, we can extract, for example, just the media outlets in Malaysia and see which ones are specifically blocked. So we actually did an initial proof of concept website for this in Malaysia, covering several countries in Southeast Asia, which we call the Censorship dashboard. Probably which was nicely supported by our friends at OTF, or the Open Technology Fund. So now, based on whatever results that are being submitted or tests that are being submitted to OONI, what we've got, we've created a simple dashboard. I think it's at censorship.sinarproject.org that will extract all the test results from the OONI API and allow you to browse by rights categories, for example. So example here, I think it's not that clear, but for example, I can quickly go and see that it seems that in Indonesia, there's quite a large number of anomalies across, for example, news, where it's not happening so much in Myanmar. And there seems to be a few anomalies in Malaysia. So you can now see a quick overview of what kind of possible sites are being blocked based on different categories. It can be, I'm kind of repeating myself, but you can see quickly that seems that in Indonesia, for example, there's probably a need to investigate a little bit further in terms of religious websites being blocked in 2020. And we're able to also see across different ISPs. So here's an example. I think the one that I have here, which is not that sharp, we have an example where for some ISPs it's 0. So it could mean that that ISP doesn't block it, but it can also mean that we don't have enough coverage of that ISP. So therefore, we don't know whether there's actually any sort of blocking on that ISP or not. Okay. The second situation that we face when using OONI for measurements is what we call live or dynamic events. These are things like elections and protests, and they can be, and quite often they're quite short, just a day or two, and sometimes even just a few hours. So the challenge for these sort of tests for protests and elections is that the URLs can change in terms of the URL that you need to test during, say, a protest might be a website that was just created, the morning of the protest. So therefore, it's not in your test list. Or it can change hour by hour. I shared earlier that sometimes the lists, the most common kind of censorship method is the DNS hijacking. So one way that certain websites in Southeast Asia do to avoid this is that they would create like different subdomains or have multiple domains that point to the same website. So within, let's say, a protest period or an election period of 2 hours, you could have possibly 5 different URLs and different domains for the same page to stop government censorship of your site. And it's like a little whack-a-mole situation. So what our experience in doing this, so for dynamic measurements of protests, our experience is that you need to prepare for this. So if you're a civil society monitoring group, for example, or if you want to be able to get good measurements during these dynamic events, you should try to prepare for it. And the reason, it's hard. The reason for it is that it's really hard to troubleshoot problems during dynamic events. People are, tear gas and running away, and or people are getting arrested, or there's like 5 different reports from different people that you don't know online, and to try to troubleshoot those things remotely at a hectic time is really, really hard to do. And so if you are not prepared, you may not get the data that you need in terms of tests, and you actually end up wasting time troubleshooting things when that event, let's say a protest, could be over within 2 or 3 hours. So our recommendation from our experience doing this first initially in Malaysia, but then it's been adapted in Thailand and also Cambodia for their last elections, was that you should organize some workshops ahead of time. So if you know that there's going to be an election in, say, 3 months, you should plan for some kind of training workshops with civil society partners or media partners to get ready and install, like, for example, OONI apps on the phone to collect data, and then also to troubleshoot and test during that workshop itself, so that people are not going to be installing it just as the protest is happening. And you also have a clear way of communicating in terms of people who already know how to use the apps quite well to be able to get you the information that you need. So the other, the other one that you should, in terms when you're doing this preparation, is to also ensure coverage of ISPs. This is something that we work with our partners in Cambodia, in the sense that it's not really helpful if you have only if all the people that you prepared from your workshop all just use one ISP. It could be that in different areas of of a country that there's better coverage by ISPs or used by different people, or as I shared earlier, that different ISPs might have different allegiances to either their company, their private ownership, or whether they're state controlled and so on. So when you're doing this preparation, it'll be good to actually identify one is like which areas that you have your teams or participants doing the testing in terms of geographical area, but you should also try to ensure coverage of ISPs, so that if you say you have a group of 20 trained, that maybe maybe there's enough in that group of 20 to cover all 6 ISPs if there's 6 ISPs in the country. So yeah, this is one of our workshops that we did for Southeast Asia in terms of preparing some civil society for these tests in advance. So part of this preparation is you should also try, you should use OONI Run to prepare some lists that are related towards this dynamic event. So for example, the complete test lists for some countries like Malaysia, I think it's up to like 700 or 1,000 different URLs. You probably, for example, so during a protest, testing a pornography website, for example, for access is probably not what you're looking for. You don't want to waste bandwidth on, that sort of test. Well, there's a protest on an election going on. So rather for election protests, for example, you'd probably just want to make sure, for example, that both local and news media coverage or key sites are in your list of tests. You probably want to have some other key sites, for example, possibly related to emergency services or some government or electoral results websites and so on. And you can prepare these lists so that it's these custom lists using the OONI Run tool. It's at run.oni.io, and we found it to be quite useful, and you can save these links in advance. And the other part is, I shared the fact that it's quite dynamic. So you should have them ready to be modified. So you should have a long list. I just have it as a text file because the Run OONI website allows you to just cut and paste a long list of URLs, and if there's a sudden change, to be ready to modify that link and have some channels to share it. You could use social media for this, for example, to run, where you say, hey everybody, this is the link that we need help from the public and your activist group that you trained before to run. Or it could be something like a WhatsApp or a Signal group where you also share it internally, where there's updates to this list as the dynamic event is happening. So I'll share an example of, say, such a dynamic event, which is like the last Malaysian elections in 2018. So this is something that we were not quite prepared for. During the election results, so in Malaysia, unlike say Indonesia, the results come in hour by hour, and the entire general election for Malaysia, the results are known within the same day itself. So as the results were not, how to describe it, didn't seem to, early results or polling results didn't seem to be favorable. For 2 hours, independent election results monitoring site run by Malaysia Kini was blocked on some ISPs and through DNS hijacking. And we basically had that small window of 2 hours to do enough tests with OONI to collect data and to collect evidence that it was actually being blocked. So luckily enough, we managed to get at least 3 to 5 results confirming this on two ISPs. And that result, of course, that resulted in a large outrage the next day, where there was a change in government, and as a result of the coverage by a reporter from the Malay Mail, that what was it? I think it was Zurairi, citing our report. and follow-ups by him, we now had clear evidence back. We had clear evidence and data backed with measurement data to show that it was actually blocked. So it's not something that could be denied anymore. And said that journalist actually followed it up some more and actually ended up with the actual notice to the ISPs for that blocking. So yeah. Sure if there's some questions and answers yet. Okay, so I'm just gonna end here that this is kind of not the end of it. So there's other avenues for more collaborations in terms of testing. So one of the things that can be done with different groups, for example, is that you could do a legal analysis of why certain sites were blocked. So in Malaysia, when we saw when a lawyer was investigating which sites were blocked and under what laws, we actually went back through our measurement data, looked at all the different sites were blocked, and then actually checked what laws did the government say each site was blocked under. And the other part as well is that network measurement is just one key data point. We should also look towards working together beyond just activists, for example, but for example with community groups. So so some ideas that we had that we wanted to do, for example, was to also include include the continuous testing, for example, at community internet centers, where we could add, for example, in the list to be tested would be key services, for example, that people would be accessing from these internet centers. How fast is the so-called free Wi-Fi at these centers? And how often or were sites or government services that people wanted to do or depended on were actually accessible from these sites. So these are certain other areas beyond just rights where we could collaborate with community groups. And the other benefit about working with these groups is that you should also start looking at additional dimensions beyond the kind of whether a site is accessible or not from a technical viewpoint, but also whether that site or service could actually be useful to the community groups that you're working with. So there's no point, for example, if say there's a welfare aid and you can access that site, but you can't actually complete the submission to get welfare aid, for example. So you should work with these groups to get additional data points beyond just whether its site is blocked or not. And that comes to kind of my conclusion for my presentation today. So
thank you very much, Khairil. Excellent work that you've been doing all these years, and I can say that for OONI, you've been you and Sinar project have we've learned so much from you, and I think it's thanks to great collaborations and partnerships with organizations like Sinar project that we've been able to bring the project to where it is today, and so I really thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah.
I would remind you that you can leave questions in the chat on the Slack channel or on the pad. We have several questions that we've received so far, but I think we have time for more. So please, be sure to add them. So the first question comes from Diane, and the question is: we know that there's a barrier to adding to the test list. Especially if, for example, you're a journalist without good understanding of the platform. Are there existing initiatives within the civil society or Sinar where it's easier to contribute?
Okay, I would say talk to Igor. But yeah, so yes, there is. So again, I mentioned it a few times. If you missed it, do check Igor's Igor's presentation. Igor from Metallica. So there is an initiative supported by OTF and run by Igor and Metallica to actually work with researchers and other groups to improve these test lists. He actually has a really nice methodology in terms of just editing the test lists in spreadsheets, as well as a clear methodology on how to update them and what are the criteria for adding or removing a test list. So yes, so on this case, yes, there's an initiative, not by Sinar, but by Metallica and Igor. Yeah.
Great. And I would also add, as Maria mentioned in the chat as well, we have plans of working on a web-based platform that, as in OONI, that would allow people to contribute to test lists in an easier way. I should also say that if you have some specific URLs that you would like to have added and you're not familiar with GitHub, feel free to just reach out to us directly at contact@openobservatory.org, and we can help out in adding them to the testing list.
Yeah, we've had that experience as well here on not just because of the technical barrier, but sometimes it's also for the safety barrier. So sometimes we've had actually where people would just submit the URLs to you in a spreadsheet format or something, and where we would contribute it because we're safer in Malaysia versus say the country where that URL was contributed from.
Yeah, that's a good point. So another question comes from Zimming, and the question is, can you also share how you, Sinar project, coordinated the entire region's censorship measurement, especially during specific occasions like elections?
Okay, I think it was in my slides, right? So we gave that example where Cambodia was the first one, where we helped them out. But I also shared in that slide, maybe I didn't do it clearly, was that that workshop, when I said we should prepare it, that's when we actually picked, we got through support through OTF to actually get a few activists from different parts of our region to get some training and on actually how to run it and then conduct it later. So yeah, we did support for that for Cambodia. And then we didn't do it directly. I mentioned that before. Thai Netizen took our experiences from Malaysia and Cambodia and then adopted it themselves. So they were preparing for their elections based on what we shared and experienced in Cambodia and Malaysia.
Nice. Cool. So another question comes from Maria, and she asks, for community members interested in coordinating censorship measurement efforts in their countries or regions, what advice and best practices would you have to share?
For me, I would actually coordinate with what your specific area is, or what sort of communities that you have. So, for example, if you're looking for media freedom, you should find or collaborate with the people that are working in media freedom. So, for example, in Malaysia, I would work with, let's say, Center for Independent Journalism, or I think in Cambodia, there's an organization called CCIM for independent media. And one is that you would work with them because they would know the state of media, for example. So they would know every single online, paper that there is, or they would actually have the online sites, complete sites that you should be testing for. And the other part is that it will become a collaborative thing. So we kind of need the URLs for testing. They also need, better evidence in terms of monitoring, let's say, online freedom in their countries. So I would work with these different groups to know, because they know better, like what tests should be tested on. So yeah, another example for that we do, for example, in Malaysia is we measure. There's actually a category, the citizen test list for, let's say, sex education, right? So how do I which community would be that, then it will be, kind of women rights and gender groups and reproductive health groups and civil society that would be able to help you know which URLs exist. So work with the communities that have the knowledge of what should be tested and what sites should be accessible.
Great, thanks for that. And I guess we can also, if you have some specific links of organizations or groups that you think could be of interest to the viewers, we can add them as well in the video description as resources for people to check out. So I also have a question for you, which is one that I've been asking other projects that sort of work on using network measurement tools as part of advocacy work and as well as policymaking, I guess. And it's since we're here at the Internet Measurement Village, what specific do you have some like a wish list or some specific things that you would like to see network measurement tools doing that we're not currently doing? And I guess this is not just for OONI, but for the many other network measurement projects that are present here, like IOTA, Censored Planet, etc. So is there something that some specific request that you would have?
Okay. I mean, right now, I know, have discussions that I've had with Maria, OONI's pretty much kind of resolved most of the issues that we have, like the rapid results and so on. But yeah, if there's anything, it's it would be better coverage on, how to describe it, better coverage on the Citizen Lab test lists, because and to have that more widely adopted by different measurement groups. So it doesn't have to be just an OONI test. It could be, let's say, a broadband speed test, right? Like how fast is, so not only would we be able to measure, say, whether, let's say, an online media platform is accessible or not, but how fast are those platforms, right? So it could be that an independent media group is not censored, but because they're so underfunded that their servers are dead slow, right? So that's a different set of measurements, which some other people might be testing. So if we're all kind of using the Citizen Lab test list as a reference, then we could have kind of these combined coverage from multiple dimensions, not just in terms of network interference. So yeah, that would be something that would be nice. So that I would be able to go, let's say somebody's doing speed of URLs, I'd be able to go to their site, use the test list to extract all the data for, let's say, media freedom in Malaysia, and say, which media sites are relatively fast or accessible in Malaysia on different ISPs. Yep. So that would be just one idea I would throw out there. Yep.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the great thing about the test list project is that it's somehow a good integration layer, if you wish, between the various measurement projects. And I know that other projects like IC Lab or Censored Planet are already drawing from the test list. So I think it's definitely something that we should do more of, sharing data and comparing our results so that we can establish somehow a better ground truth about what's.
And then the other one that I kind of mentioned, I think briefly, was about how sometimes the kind of international rankings and reports are just anecdotal evidence. I think that us in kind of the more technical community, in terms of network measurements and all these other things, should find more ways to collaborate with these other groups, like people preparing reports on, say, freedom of media in a country, for example, or international rankings of internet access, to have our data included as reference points in these reports, or to improve them. And I've seen already some progress in that. So I've seen a few cases in Indonesia where journalists are just saying like, oh, look, the site is blocked, use OONI to measure it, right? So now instead of just a reporter trying to finding some expert to give a quote on whether it's blocked or not, journalists in Indonesia are like more and more journalists that I'm seeing in Indonesia are actually just using OONI, and when they say it's blocked, they're actually showing actual, technical measurements of that, and not some source.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Not muted, right? Yeah. So I guess I would ask you if you have do you have some things that you would like to addressing the internet freedom community out there, like some specific like other things that you would like to share with them, some resources or follow-up things that you think people watching this video should be aware of or should look into?
Yeah, I touched on that on my last slides. So one of the things that we're kind of seeing now, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that basically that digital divide. I touched that briefly, that we should start looking, when we're doing these collaborations, like I said, to look in these other dimensions on how our tools can help out, in terms of highlighting the data of these kind of digital divides. And how, so one of the fascinating things we found when we did our workshops using the Raspberry Pis was that we found out that it was powerful enough as a normal internet access platform, right? For community groups. So that's one way is like where we kind of sneak in the network measurements, in the sense that by having the same Raspberry Pi running the OONI probe, we can also collaborate in terms of actually providing a community access terminal, and then also work with the groups to have what I've said, a multidimensional aspect to internet access, speed, censorship, and then as well as the actual services provisions, and the services that they're supposed to be accessing. Just doesn't mean that just because you have the URL means that the information there is actually useful to you or not as a community.
Great. Yeah, that's a good point, and definitely an area that needs to be looked at more. So we have a last question that comes from Ziming, and the question is, you were mentioning about the potential risk for running OONI tests in some countries in the region. Do you have any advices or strategy to reduce those risks?
Wow.
Beyond that of understanding the laws?
Yeah, I mean, this was a hard challenge that we faced. Like, I mentioned that in, I think, one of my, during that presentation, where in some countries, you don't want, that risk is too high to do the test. And you can't actually do Tor or VPN because you need to access it from that local ISP. That puts you at risk. For this, there's just no easy answer to this. Some people started to, say that there's creative ways, like bring a Raspberry Pi or do your testing to, your local, hack, like your local hackers meetup or something, and hide and do that test out of, like 100 activists or something. No, 100, I don't know what you call it, hardware hackers or something like that. But then I'm not entirely sure that's advisable, because then, a whole group of Raspberry Pi and Arduino folks will suddenly get hauled up in that country. So maybe that's not advisable. But there's no easy, safe way of doing this. And so it's, for this sort of situation, it's just a case-by-case basis. Some people have suggested, like, doing it in a shopping mall with a free Wi-Fi connection or something like that. But even then, when I thought about that a little bit further, there's still a risk because there's CCTV surveillance and whatnot. And unfortunately I can't really answer this for Ziming. I did mention that that in some countries that they're shifting, even in Malaysia right now, is that they're shifting to offline restrictions. So you could probably run the test, but the way that they restrict internet freedom now is more on just chilling effects of you possibly being arrested. And when that happens, there's just no easy way of circumventing that with or doing OONI tests where you want to have the ISP. Circumventing it through Tor is not actually testing the local ISP, for example. So yeah, sadly, no easy answers for that.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for the time. I would like to thank you again so much, Khairil, for joining us today in and presenting the great work that you're doing in Malaysia, but also to support of all the communities in Southeast Asia.
Great.
So thank you so much.
And thanks for having me as well. All right.
And I would also like to thank everybody for joining in from the internet today for the live presentation, or the people that will be viewing this in the future. I will also like to remind you that tomorrow at 14:00 UTC, we're going to have another presentation from Anton and Natalia from Digital Security Lab Ukraine. And they'll be telling us all about how they established a nationwide internet censorship measurement system in Ukraine. So, remember to tune in tomorrow.
Yeah.
So, thank you again for joining, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Bye.